quick, and I'll let Dr. Bosso introduce himself a little bit more, but um, I think that one of the most important things is to realize that everything we're talking about in terms of food safety, food sustainability, food defense, no one person and no one solution is going to be able to get this done. That it really does take a dialogue, and that there are some of us who engage with so many different stakeholders and leaders to do this kind of work. Chris Bosso is one of those people. Chris Bosso is one of those people who has uh, I don't want to say been around the block, but definitely has been a voice that has gathered a lot of interest. People want to have the academic voice, but one of the things I most appreciate about Dr. Bosso is that in his role, he has also brought many voices from industry to journalists to policymakers and to students who in their research are increasing the dialogue. So I've asked him to come and talk with us today. I've got a PowerPoint up and ready to go for you, but I think you're going to have to tell me to advance every time here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chris Bosso.
Well, thanks a lot, Darin. Let me quick introduction about myself. I am a professor of political science and public policy here at Northeastern University. Been here for a few decades. And as a political scientist by training, I think about the politics of food systems more than anything else. But as a policy scholar, I'm also interested in the problems that we address in the food space. I've been working in the area of food for about 20 years, environmental policy, food policy, and other policy domains. But again, I come to this a bit from the lens of a political scientist, thinking about political systems and governance issues. But the work I'm increasingly getting into is on food systems broadly understood and thinking about urban food systems in particular. Northeastern being an urban university, we sort of do that by default. I'm not at an agricultural college in the middle of the Midwest, so obviously my framing on food systems will have an urban lens. And a lot of the work we're doing at Northeastern now is really on food system resilience and sustainability. And my colleagues in the School of Public Policy, Urban Affairs, and other parts of the university looking closely at these issues. So what I want to do today is spend a few minutes, just a little time on food system resilience from a broad lens, and then hone in a little bit on urban. And so I'm not going to, I happen to look real quickly at some of the slides and the posters you sent in. And so what I won't talk about today is like issues like food deserts or food access from that classic sense. So I may touch on it a little bit. But what I'm really going to just focus a bit up here is on some big questions that I think policymakers and others in the food space are trying to think about, particularly as it intersects the way our food systems work today and as they're likely to be challenged by climate change, for example, sea level rise if you're in Boston, and other kinds of challenges. So, Darin, why don't you go ahead and switch to the next slide.
Well, I'm not on any slides. Here we go.
Okay, so next slide. There we go. Great. So I want to, I don't know to what extent you've covered this, but I want to remind everybody in the class what I always remind students of my own courses about any food systems course. So that is, for most of us in the United States, and indeed for most people in what we might call developed economies, Western Europe and other places, and increasingly, economies that are emerging economies with a large middle class, but for most of us in the United States in particular, we become accustomed to a food system that delivers to most of us, and I have to say most of us, whatever we want, when we want it, at a price we're willing to pay. I mean, I think that's something we need to understand. I mean, for most of us in this space, we have become accustomed to a food system that literally gets us anything we want when we want it. And if you're in an urban space like Boston, pretty much, you can get on your app and get stuff delivered to your door pretty quickly, or you can go to any kind of store and get what you want, or any kind of grocery store. I mean, if you want to go Whole Foods, you can go Whole Foods. If you want to go Walmart, you can go Walmart. I mean, everything in between. And so we have become accustomed to a food system that is remarkably able to do that. And I think we always need to remember that whenever we think about critiques of the food system, which are plenty. But what do we want? We want convenience. We want when we want it. I mean, you want Domino's at 10 o'clock at night, you got it. You want Thai, you got it delivered to you. For a lot of us, you can get Grubhub or Uber Eats to deliver what you want when you want it. You want variety. I mean, wherever you may live, I live in a city where literally I could have any ethnic cuisine any night of the week I want. I could have variety. So I have variety. I have convenience, variety. I have taste. I mean, obviously, I want to taste good, and I can be mindful of the cost. I could tailor that to whatever cost structure I'm encountering. So we have, in human history terms, we've got a food system that is able to deliver to us a remarkable variety of convenient, tasty, and frankly, in the American context, relatively inexpensive food. I mean, Americans spend roughly 10% or less of their per capita take-home income on food. So we've got a food system that can do that. And increasingly, of course, and part of the reasons why we have courses like this, we're increasingly concerned about the conditions of production. Whatever those conditions might be, whether they're ecological impacts, food safety impacts, human, sort of animal welfare impacts, or other impacts of the food system, nutrition, obesity, whatever. But remember, sort of the basic takeaway here is that for most of us, the food system gives us what we want. And what kind of food system can meet the demands of approximately 323 million Americans? It's a question I'm always asking. So next slide. So I think that it just reminds us that, and again, I'm not quite sure how much you covered on this, that this food system is to deliver all these things to us. This food system is highly industrialized, and in a classic term of industrialization, not a negative connotation, but a classic concept of industrialization. It's highly mechanized, economies of scale, it's specialized, it is designed to deliver you massive quantities of commodities that then converted into final foodstuffs along the way. But is at a level of scale and specialization and mechanization no different than if you're delivering an iPhone, in many respects, or an automobile. It is industrialization in that classic understanding of industrial. It's got high input needs. I mean, industrial systems are high input systems. They're high input on technology, on capital, labor at some points. A lot of it's automated, but still, in some points, there is labor. Processing a lot of fresh foods requires labor, but a lot of agriculture, a lot of food production is increasingly automated. It's got high energy inputs, high chemical inputs, on and on and on and on. Subsistence food systems basically are labor intensive, whereas industrial food systems are intensive in all these other ways. That allows you to have mechanization and specialization and economies of scale.
Dr.
And it also,
Bosso,
yeah.
really quick, if you're a student who's on the Boston campus, this will probably be a little bit more something you connect with. In the Curry Center, the food area, Dr. Bosso, have you seen this kind of robot-ish tea kiosk? You can get tea and you punch in things on a keyboard or whatever, and it's got a robot that makes a perfect tea.
Yes.
I look at that and I think that, it's like, all automated. But I think about how it's lost in terms of the human labor that went into it before it became this robot of the future.
Well, I mean, there is that degree of which, obviously, it's, one of the things about these kind of systems is you also have a stress on efficiency. And efficiency can be defined as keeping input costs low. And so if labor becomes expensive, then you want to replace labor with technology. And I think you're seeing a lot of that in the food space. Especially those kinds of things that can be, I've been to Japan, and Japan is way ahead of us on this automation side. Where you can get automated a lot of stuff in Japan because they have a labor, issue there. So, I think Yeah, you're right. I mean, we have automation sometimes in place of labor costs, and sometimes simply because of an efficiency standpoint from technology. But you're right. I mean, in countries where you have slack labor, excess labor, you can maintain a lot of labor in the food system that way. But you're seeing that I think, in the food system a lot, where you're replacing people with robotics or with other technologies. You also cut costs, by the way, and improve efficiencies by having standardized commodities. You pretty much don't have in the food system, 20 different kinds of tomatoes in the dominant food system. You may have 2 or 3 that are designed to be, highly productive on the space allotted, resistant to being monolot, and can travel far distances and are, and grow very well. So the dominant food system does not like variety in the sense of a lot of different kinds of different commodity crops. 1 or 2 kinds of soybeans, 1 or 2 kinds of feed corn. Only a few kinds of different commodity crops, because you're going to maximize the production of a single kind of commodity and reduce the number and variety of species produced. Now, there's trade-offs on that, obviously, because there's always the concerns, as we'll talk about a little bit later, concerns about what happens in a monoculture system if you have a disease or a pest that you did not expect. And also, simple systems, monoculture systems, also are far more susceptible to diseases and pests than our diverse systems. We know that, which is why you have a lot of heavy use of chemicals. They're efficient, again, in the sense of economic efficiency, keeping costs low, of inputs low. They're tightly connected. The stress on speed, efficiency, and timeliness. I mean, the one thing that really marks the contemporary food system is, literally, if I want raspberries in January in Boston, I can get them flown in from South America or from Mexico, to my door within 3 days of them being picked. That's remarkable in human history terms, by the way. I mean, that level of the tight connectedness of our food system is something that, on one hand, is a remarkable aspect. On the other hand, it's something that people worry about, because tightly coupled systems also have a degree of susceptibility to, being disrupted. They're not necessarily always resilient. They're, the more tightly connected a system is, the more susceptible it is to what they call perturbations or interruptions. And they're global. It's a global system. I mean, that's one thing I think we fail to understand sometimes, how globalized the food system has become to meet seasonal demands, keep costs low, and maximize efficiency and scale. I mean, it literally is cheaper if you're catching Alaska salmon off the coast of Alaska, it's literally cheaper for you to ship the whole fish to China, be processed in China, and then shipped back to the United States as finished seafood pieces or fillets than it is to do that in the United States. I mean, so it's a really interesting food system where you find the spots in the production system where the costs are lowest. No different than an iPhone. Again, I use that example. Next slide. I can do it myself, Gavin. So Darin.
There you go.
I think if I don't hit it too hard. All right. So the industrial food system, it's also a concentrated one increasingly. Fewer and larger farms. This is true globally, not just in the United States. That the larger, especially when you're producing crop monoculture, the larger the farms, the more efficient they are. So you get 3,000, 4,000 acres to grow row crops like soybeans or corn, feed corn or wheat. You've got even larger operations in places like Brazil. You've got concentrated animal feeding operations of thousands of head of thousands of head of hogs and cattle, tens of thousands of chickens and turkeys, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are far more efficient, larger operations. They're highly mechanized, as I pointed out. And in the high technology inputs in these large mega operations, where literally one farmer can harvest an entire wheat crop with one big large combine guided by a GPS and maybe even a drone. The focus on monoculture, as I pointed out, and specialization is part of that concentration, but also concerns about susceptibility to diseases and pests. Again, the side, and the side effects of a lot of this concentration is the squeezing out of smaller farmers. New England's a bit of an exception. We don't do sort of commodity agriculture much in New England, except maybe dairy, and that's small dairy operations being killed these days. So there are larger operations, the small family farm is being squeezed out, except in very high specialty kinds of crops that are primarily being serving farmers markets or high-end restaurants. And they're globalized commodity markets, like I said, where concerns about global long chains begin to become an issue. So let me sort of go from that broad overview then into sort of more directed questions about system resilience. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let me just click the next slide. One example, concentration in meatpacking, something Professor Detwiler knows a lot about. The meat industry. If you are in New England, in Boston area, where I am, you are far away from the source of most of your meat. Most of your meat, unless you're buying locally raised grass-fed beef or pork or chickens, which is a relatively small percentage of us, you're mostly buying your meat from either the Midwest, places like Iowa, Nebraska, Texas, Southwest, or places like North Carolina, where you have concentration in meat-producing facilities. Why are they there? Because that's where the grain is. I mean, meat producers understood a long time ago, beginning about 40, 50 years ago, meat producers realized that moving cattle to like Chicago to be slaughtered for the urban market didn't make any sense. You could slaughter the animals nearer to their food sources, soybeans and corn, slaughter them there, freeze the meat, or ship it, fresh by truck or railroad, or even air freight if you needed to, get there more quickly, cheaper, more efficiently, and it's closer to the source of their grain. Grain's expensive to move, so it's a lot easier to keep all the feed grain near the animals, raise the animals and slaughter them, and then ship the finished products to markets. So that concentration in meat processing means that if you are a consumer in the Boston area, you're basically dependent on a long 1,500-mile chain in some cases, maybe even longer, of meat getting to your door. Now think about this in terms of almost every other product you can think of. Fruits and vegetables from California, Florida, seafood. A lot of seafood, as we'll see, is imported from all over the world. So the food chains are very long. You have concentration of production in fewer places where it used to be much more spread out. And New England doesn't really have much of a slaughter capacity. If you wanted to build more, have more locally produced beef, you have very few slaughterhouses. So there's infrastructure is missing in New England for a lot of meat and food processing generally. Over the decades, it's gone from being regional to being national and international and concentrated. And where your food comes from. I mean, you may have covered some of this already before, but a lot of our food is, a lot of U.S. total food supply, by comparisons, we export a lot of food in the United States, a lot of commodities. We also import. About 20%, if not a little bit higher, of the total U.S. food supply is imported, but 70% or more of seafood is imported. I mean, even in Boston area, if you go to your standard grocery store and buy seafood, unless it says otherwise, you can pretty much bet that a high percentage of your seafood is shipped from all over the world frozen. Shrimp especially, a lot of other seafood products. That local seafood, is more expensive. I know some exceptions. Lobster is obviously an exception. But for the most part, even in New England, a lot of seafood in chain restaurants, in a lot of grocery stores, are imported seafood. Similarly, obviously, especially in off-season, fresh produce is imported. So again, these are long food chains where, again, if you're Professor Detwiler and studying food safety, especially in fresh foods, the safety issues get to become a concern. But just think in terms of getting food to your door, how long these chains have come. As we no longer think seasonally as much as we used to in terms of food consumption. So therefore, we become to demand, fresh foods in all times of the year, even if seasonality is, it's a different kind of seasonality question. So, sorry. Go ahead. Okay, can I be done in about 10 minutes? Okay, I'm giving a lecture, sorry. I'm in a room where I'm squatting for a minute. As a result, getting food to our door involves a long chain of and choke points. I mean, obviously, we have a situation where, if you look at this diagram here, we have the food production side and then the food retail and consumption side, but there are choke points in the system on food distribution and wholesaling. And that's what I want to focus on here in the next few slides. And again, you have the slides, and I'll sort of take a look at them there. Here's, again, a local example. If you are a Boston consumer of fresh produce, almost all of your produce goes into the New England Produce Center, which is located in where the dot is at the map in Everett. And that's a sort of a visual picture there. Almost all the fresh fruits and vegetables in the region come through that one produce center. That means it's brought in by truck or by sea or by air to that one space, and then it goes out to distribution points by the grocery stores or other producers. But if that one space gets knocked out, that causes real problems for the distribution systems for fresh fruits and vegetables. And the New England Produce Center is actually located along a river, as you can see there. It actually is in a floodplain. And so there's real questions about what happens when you have a major climate kind of Superstorm Sandy kind of event where you might get 100-year storm surges. That's a real concern there. And what happens with major snowstorms knock out access to that facility? How do you distribute fresh fruits and vegetables? Another example, the Boston area's distribution of supermarket distribution centers. You can't see that well here, but the distribution centers for most of our major supermarket systems are outside the city. They're 40 miles, 40 miles away along major highways because that's where the land is, that's where the access is. But if you knock out those highways for major distribution system. So people are worried about that. Go ahead, question?
Oh, your audio cut out for a minute.
Okay, sorry about that. There might be an intermittent. So obviously, the point about this is that where the food distribution occurs is influenced also by land costs, by transportation, but also may be susceptible to being knocked out under certain conditions. What's important to understand here is that what's good for efficiency isn't always good for resilience. Or very good in terms of resilience in terms of sustaining shocks to the system and returning to normal. So having very efficient systems can be susceptible to disruption. Another example, and this is one of my favorite, Greater Boston's emergency food system. The Greater Boston Food Bank feeds over 500,000 people a year through all these affiliated organizations, food pantries, homeless shelters, social service agencies, serves 58 million pounds of food a year or 48 million meals. It's got this big facility, very efficient. But also, it's located at the intersection of a major highway in Boston, Route 93, and Melnia Cass Boulevard, in a location that was frankly available because of the site, an industrial section that was susceptible to, in fact, sea level rise and to being disrupted by major snowstorms. In fact, it did shut down for several days in 2015 when we had major storms because trucks could not get through. And therefore, the disruption to the emergency food system was actually very acute for almost a couple of weeks. So again, another sensitive system problem. Again, things that people are thinking about. How do you then distribute these systems so that they don't get disruptive is a major question. Finally, more broadly, what local policymakers worry about. The areas in blue indicate flooding by 2050 during high tide based on sea level projections. A lot of these areas in blue are major either food distribution points such as the produce center, the airport area in red, which is also susceptible, or highway systems. So the impact on major transportation arteries, the airports, et cetera, train, railroad lines, is really of a concern in terms of food distribution and shipment. So the point of all this, and I'm sorry to be rushing, I apparently am squatting in a room I'm not supposed to be in, is that there's a lot of concern in food system thinking these days about resilience, about how do we make a food system that has become very focused on efficiency with all those great impacts, much more resilient in face of potential shocks, either man-made shocks such as potential terrorism, or natural shocks such as hurricanes, snowstorms, earthquakes, sea level rise, whatever. And what's good for resilience may not be good for efficiency. And so there's a real question here that food systems people are really worried about in terms of how do you balance these competing norms? How do you get a food system that continues to give people what they want at a price they can afford, but also make that system far more resilient, especially in urban areas where you're far away from, in fact, most of the sources of food. Now, let's stop right there and take a few questions.
All right, let's go ahead and open it up to questions from students.
We have anybody left?
No, we got, there's 7 or 8 students here.
Good.
Any questions for our guest lecturer?
Yep, and sorry if I went too fast, but I was, like, squatting in a room here.
Here we go. Bo?
Yes, hello. When I was reading about it a little bit, like a quick Google search, I live in currently lower Texas, College Station, Texas, and we just had Hurricane Harvey right when I got here. And I was just curious, I know bigger cities are kind of looking at this, building up these kind of systems that are more resilient. Is this something that they are taking into action like now, or is this all like future plans? How far are we going with this, or is it kind of
right now yeah, I think that's a good question. I think you're seeing now a lot of places begin to study this because I take it more seriously. We've had several studies done in Boston and other cities looking at this issue. Obviously, there's been coordination. There's some discussions among a lot of different stakeholders in Boston area, for example, on this, where utilities and food distribution people, emergency food system people, grocery store chains begin to talk to each other about these issues. But I'd be blunt in saying we're probably not where we need to be by decades. And I think what you're beginning to see is conversation. That's the point.
Go ahead, Bob. Oh, okay. Bob is asking his question. Sorry.
And I may be moving to a different room, so I'll carry the computer with me. Sorry about that.
All right, well, one student is typing a question. Oh.
Go ahead.
Besides the fear of major disruption, can economic incentives be used to make cities more resilient? Hello?
Hold on, let me get my headphone on. I apologize for the disruption here, but I apparently was in the wrong room here, and I didn't realize where I was supposed to be.
So class, this is what happens when you're live. We overcome things.
Let me find another room here. Hold on, I gotta get out of the hallway. This is what happens sometimes. Yes.
So while we're in a transition here,
I'll be in the hallway here. So go ahead.
So okay, so the question is: besides the fear of major disruption, can economic incentives be used to make cities more resilient?
I mean, yeah, the short answer is yes. The longer answer, as you can imagine, is more complicated, and that is who's going to pay for it. It's always the question of, there's a room here I can sneak into. There's always the question of, tax incentives, of course. You could have maybe distribute systems more, or to make systems more resilient. Whoops. Am I still there?
Yep, I hear you.
Sorry about that. And so I know that Boston area folks are looking at, how to, for example, think about what to do about the produce center. Now, the produce center is privately owned, so they have to provide, but they would have to provide incentives for the produce center to sort of maybe elevate itself more to get out for floodplain, or move somewhere else. But if you move somewhere else that's less susceptible to flooding because of its location, then you'd create another problem of, okay, let's say you move it out of the city, put it out where it's less likely to be affected by, say, storm surges, but then you raise the question of, okay, the food still has to go out to it to get to it, so you have transportation links issues again. So these things are, I think what people are beginning to look at, do more of, is think in terms of systems. What do we need to do in terms of distributing these distribution and processing systems so they are more distributed out, so that if you knock one out, you don't knock everything out. For example, in New England, milk is still highly produced in a regional sense. You may not think milk's important, but for a lot of people it is. But most of the milk is being shipped in from out of the city now, from 30 to 70 miles increasingly, because it's just more efficient to do so. So how do you create incentives for companies or producers to either locate their processing facilities closer to where the consumers are, but at the same time you have land cost issues? So I think there's a lot of discussion about these kinds of questions, and it may well be it's less about focusing on the actual facilities and more focusing on the linkages. How do you improve transportation links? How do you ensure that those links aren't affected as much? How do you improve communication links? How do you maybe have storage capacity, maybe backup storage? But again, anything you do to increase resilience increases costs in some way, shape, or form, at least upfront costs.
And I think, too, just the kind of spider web of interconnectedness. I was just in Seattle, and Seattle's having a resurgent of a high-tech boom in terms of Amazon and other industries coming in. As a result, you have these people who now want to live right there in Seattle. I had not been there for about 5 years. The change in how much housing is in downtown Seattle in 5 years was mind-blowing. That affects the traffic, but that also affects access to food.
Right.
So
where the Amazon headquarters is,
yeah, exactly, which is ironic because allegedly they can get you your food faster, but it's so hard to get anywhere. So now we probably have to look at drones like they're doing in Dubai, kind of a scenario. But I think we might have time for one more question, because I know Dr. Bosso has another presentation or engagement he's got to go to. Do we have any more questions from our students? I see someone's microphone. Nope, it looks like it. All right, well, Dr. Bosso, thank you very much, and I really appreciate a great look at the idea of, we can't look at every city, we can't look at every country, but if we can take a look at our own city right here and say, here are some challenges that we are facing, and if we're facing these challenges, it prompts us to look at questions we need to ask in terms of other cities, whether it's here in the United States or abroad. Questions about our policies, questions about our use of land, so many different questions that I think that our students are looking at here. So again, thank you very, very much, and I appreciate your resiliency in trying to be online with us today. But thank you very much.
I will confess to all the students that I had messed up entirely, and I thought I was going to be in a classroom getting a talk to a bunch of you, forgetting this is entirely online. And then, of course, I'm in an empty space going, oh, where am I supposed to be? So there you go. So we made it look like it was smooth, but I guarantee you, for a moment there, I was panicking.
All right.
By the way, I'll forward to you a report on the Boston Food System Resilience Report, and I'll forward that to you so you can distribute to the students if you want.
Sure, I will let you know. The irony is that last year, this class, I had someone who is now like an associate. I don't know what her job is, but she's up there. She actually works for the Greater Boston Food Bank, and that was her research was on these issues. And so I gave her a heads up that.
Is it Catherine Brennan?
No, Allison.
Oh, Allison. Okay, I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, well, thank you very, very much, and I'll look forward to your email.
Okay, see you again. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
How do I get out of here?